Video games are one of the greatest mediums for storytelling. Unique combinations of visuals, audio, dialogue, and interactivity that keeps audience engaged and immersed. Lots of game makers prioritize designing gameplay over in-depth and dramatic storytelling. And although this is the key to making a game fun, I think it's important that we, as designers, shouldn't entirely divorce gameplay from story. I'm Joseph Valencia, and I want to look at how combat in video games can act as a rhetorical means for storytelling. First off, I think it's important to establish that not every game is a story game. Some games are like full-length movies with real actors and like 100 FPS per second graphics or something, and those can make for really touching or astounding stories. But most of the time, games are just meant to be played for fun, with no deeper meanings or themes behind it, maybe just some lore here and there. Even in games without literary narratives, though, it's important to recognize that there's always some underlying intentions. The mathematician Catherine O'Neill, the author of Weapons of Math Destruction, claims that there's an inherent bias behind everyone's actions, and that bias is what shapes our design decisions when producing media, and that includes games. Bias is our natural tendency to favor things or ideas that fit into or reaffirm the preconceptions that we are most comfortable with, and it's present in everyone whether they know it or not. Bias comes from our past experiences and what we learn to associate with good, bad, and everything in between. If you grew up playing Mario, you're probably going to think this is what fun looks like. If you like reading and role-playing, you're probably going to be more engaged in games with strong narratives. If you play lots of colony sims, management games, and MMOs, your ideal game might look like this. But what's most important is the bias game makers interweave into their games, affecting what the story is about, what the topics are, and how the game looks and feels. This and this are clearly made by two different creators, with two different experiences they prefer to convey. How they actually convey these intentions to the players is done through rhetoric. Not all games want to persuade you to think about a moral message, but they all want to persuade you to play the game according to how the creator designed it, and not just spin around and stare in the corner for like an hour. I mean, you could do that, you certainly could, but the game's designers have ways of enticing you to do what they want you to do and enjoy the experience in the intended way. According to game maker Ian Bogost, rhetoric is the way they do that convincing. And in the unique case of video games, designers can use gameplay as a form of rhetoric. It's the same way authors use literary devices, or painters use composition, colors, and symbolism. Core gameplay for many games means combat. Combat is presented in all sorts of ways and is done in many manners, but it usually acts as a game's portrayal of conflict. So how does it act as rhetoric? Let's look at some examples of games that feature combat sequences as important storytelling devices. The first element of combat that I'd like to look at is the context. Before even getting into the heat of battle, what is it that led you there, and what are the stakes? In Dark Souls, you play as the Chosen Undead, whose mission is to get the first flame from Lord Gwyn and either prolong the flame or extinguish it, both options determining the fate of this dying world. In order to do this, the player must travel to the Abyss, a spreading dark corruption so horrible that a former hero, Artorias, tried venturing into it and cleansing him, but failed, only being able to save his pet wolf, Sif. Sif now guards Artorias' grave, protecting a ring that allows wearers to travel into the Abyss, which is exactly what you need in order to progress in the game. The only way to get it is to fight the poor wolf, who's only trying to stop people from going into that horrible place where her master met his untimely demise. What makes it even worse is that if you have the DLC, you can go back in time and help Sif out when she's stuck in the Abyss, causing her to recognize you before the fight, resulting in her giving out an English towel, as her gratefulness to you conflicts with her loyalty and resolve to protect her master's grave. The worst part of all, though, is that as the fight progresses, she starts limping because she's in pain. Dark Souls is not a narrative-heavy game, accomplishing most of its storytelling through its environment and random NPC dialogue instead of developmental conversations or events. This fight, however, plays an important part in its story by forcing players to fight a foe that they may not want to fight, testing their resolve against that of another, and reminding them of the importance of their end goal, while at the same time making the player feel like they're losing their humanity. Dark Souls consistently asserts that the player has long since lost their humanity to begin with, being forced to artificially restore it with an item. However, this fight serves as an important rhetorical device to really make the player feel the part, driving home the idea that they're a hollow, undead warrior doing what's necessary, instead of an emotional human being. Another factor of combat is your relationship to the person you're fighting. Now, most of the time, enemies and bosses don't have a personal relationship to you, but when you end up fighting someone you know, it might be for an important reason, and can serve as both a powerful rhetorical moment or a turning point in the story. Combat in Mother 3 can be heart-wrenching, there being tragic context behind many of the conflicts. Major spoilers for one of the best RPGs out there. In the beginning of the game, Lucas lives in a happy family on a happy island. But after the pig incident, his mother is dead, his brother Klaus gone missing, and in order to save the island, he needs to pull 7 dragon needles. He is at odds with the villainous Masked Man, who is also capable of pulling the needles. At the end of the game, he comes face to face with the Masked Man in front of the final needle. The battle begins with him knocking out your entire party using lightning. However, it's reflected off of you and does some damage to him, because you have the Franklin badge. What ensues is a long and arduous duel, but as the fight goes on, messages start appearing that you hear someone calling your name. Eventually, you realize it's your mom's voice, and she's calling out for your brother Klaus, who you realize is the Masked Man, but he himself doesn't know who he is. One of the game's mechanics is that if your enemy is asleep, you can hear their heartbeat. Klaus doesn't have a heartbeat, meaning that he likely died, and was mechanically resurrected as a cyborg without any of his memories. As the fight carries on, the background gets more and more shaky and less composed, and eventually your dad Flint jumps in the way of a big attack, taking major damage and trying to reach out to Klaus, but to no avail. Your poor family seems more torn apart than ever now that it's clear that the Klaus you knew is gone. You both keep fighting until your mother's voice starts to overpower both of you, her ghost and her memories reaching out to Klaus, causing him to remember that you were all a family once. At this point, the fight is derailed, with Lucas not knowing what to do, and with Klaus trying desperately to shut his eyes and his ears and ignore his reality after realizing the consequences of what he's been doing and who he's been fighting. Tragically, the fight ends with him removing his mask, allowing both the brothers to see each other face to face one last time, right before Klaus intentionally reflects a lightning blast off of Lucas's badge and onto himself, dealing fatal damage. He then hugs Lucas and thanks him and his dad one last time before finally leaving to join his mother. This battle and its chaotic progression convey the struggle of the torn family in a way that dialogue alone simply could not. The combination of tense music, anxious backgrounds, severe attacks, meaningful actions and inaction, and their mother's voice struggling to overpower it all allows the player to understand how poor Lucas feels through all of this, despite him being a silent protagonist this entire time. Combat is conflict, and sometimes that conflict goes beyond a physical battle and becomes a moral and mental challenge as well. This utilization of a combat sequence to portray emotional conflict is seen in the musical RPG Everhood during the Rasta Beast fight. Everhood is a very fun game where you dodge enemy attacks synced up to their amazing music, making each fight unique, even if they don't make a lot of sense. I really do recommend the game, but I'm also going to spoil it right now. The player is given a very difficult task to murder everyone you know, and of course, they're only given it once they're fully acquainted with all the game's goofy and likable characters. To me, the most likable one of them all was Rasta Beast, a caring and laid-back guy who is usually looking out for you, even in spite of the fact that pretty much everyone in Everhood is immortal. You play D&D with him, race him in Mario Kart, camp with him in the desert. He never shows any aggression, but he does show regret that he lost his friend Pink a long time ago, and wishes to not let anyone else die. Well, turns out it's death o'clock, and you end up with a strangely justified and important task that just so happens to involve myrtleizing everyone and everything. Almost no one in this game wants to die, and after you start sending people off to the afterlife, no one is more upset than Rasta Beast. You find him guarding a town full of people, sealing the entrance and protecting it with his life. This is a confrontation the player has been dreading ever since they were given the burden of killing, and yeah, it's hard. Rasta Beast starts the battle saying that you're not his friend, pretty much crushing your hopes of getting him to see eye to eye with you, and forsaking the connection you both made while you're hanging out together. Rasta Beast is cutting you off, and the fight demands that you cut him off too if you hope to win. You fight him with flames roaring in the background, and an anguishing, pretty metal song playing called Wrath of God. Are you the Wrath of God? But Rasta Beast hasn't done anything wrong. It's more likely that this difficult fight is your punishment, or more likely, a test of your resolve. Yes, this fight is difficult, and although that difficulty may force you to repeatedly retry the fight over and over, its emotional value likely won't weaken, with Rosterbeast's hateful yelling remaining a prominent feature of the fight. Testing and strengthening your resolve is an important part of Everhood because of how dubious your mission is. I hope these examples highlight for you just how powerful combat can be as a rhetorical device. This special, interactive form of conflict allows game makers to emphasize the themes or morals of their game, or develop characters and convey emotions. I think it's important that we think about the meaning behind certain fights, both when designing and when playing them. Even if designing fun gameplay is the top priority, I definitely think it's worth considering employing core gameplay as an important storytelling device, because it provides interactivity and expands upon the player's established knowledge of how the game works. And this can be used to a storyteller's advantage. Video games provide an immersion that other forms of media simply cannot replicate, which is what makes them one of the greatest mediums for telling a story. Thank you all for watching. I'm Joseph Valencia, aka Sly Pharaoh, and I hope to see you all again soon. Bye bye!